The Man with the Yin-Yang Eyes, Episode 9. Long time no see, how are you? Today I had the opportunity to join Mr. Simmons on a trip to deal with some stuff again. It's so thrilling because I don't know what it is this time. I'm sitting in Mr. Simmons's car. The luxury car sped along the road to the town of Lakeville, where Mr. Simmons is living. Although I have had many contacts with Mr. Simmons, but I didn't know he had such an expensive-looking car. This car must be very expensive, huh, Mr. Simmons? Well, I couldn't hold my curiosity and asked Mr. Simmons already. That's quite a lot of money, and I have to save some time to buy it. Me and Mr. Simmons discussed a few more sentences about the car. I think he was just saying humbly, "Mr. Simmons, your job makes a lot of money, doesn't it? I see that most of your clients are rich people. According to what I often secretly guess about Mr. Simmons, he must have a lot of money. Why are you curious about me today? This job indeed helped me accumulate a little wealth, but it is not a lot. The more humble Simmons is, the more curious I am about him. When I was young, I had the chance to receive a good teacher, and I discovered the ability to help others banish evils. However, at that time, I still did not want to enter this profession much. Later, the older I get, the more I feel that I was born into this profession. It was surprising that Mr. Simmons told me stories like this again. I listened attentively to what he had to say. Mr. Simmons also sets a lot of principles for himself when doing this exorcism work. As for the money side, you're curious, aren't you? Most of my customers are indeed rich people, but among them are also good people. When I receive help from people in difficult circumstances, I will help them without receiving money. And if the client is a rich but not very nice person, I will make more money from them than usual. Mr. Simmons slowly told me the story of his profession. Having such a decent amount of money, I make some more investments. I have a bit understanding of feng shui, geomancy, so I can consider how to invest to make a profit. Finally, Mr. Simmons also revealed that he could see a person's luck and fortune. In addition to his exorcism career, he also invests in a few other things. Me and Mr. Simmons talked for a while longer. I learned this Lakeville town is where he was born and spent his childhood. This time, his client is a young man in town. As soon as the car entered a small road, I saw another couple waiting in front of the house. "Master Simmons, here." When he saw our car coming, the guy hurriedly waved his hand and called Mr. Simmons. "Master Simmons, please park your car here." The young man directed us to the parking spot. This guy is quite young, about 20 years old, and he is pretty enthusiastic. The young man guided us very carefully. He saw us from a distance, ran back and walked in front of us, and enthusiastically led the way for us. "Hello, Master Simmons. Hello, welcome in." Mr. Simmons parked the car neatly in front of the young man's house. He greeted us, or in other words, greeted Mr. Simmons very welcoming. It looks like he was waiting for Mr. Simmons for a long time. When we arrived, he looked very happy. "Actually, I'm not the one who needs help. Here, it is my friend who really needs help." After inviting us into the house and letting us sit down, the young man introduced us to another person. Only now did I realize, it turned out that the person with the problem that needed to be solved was another person. "Have a nice day, Master Simmons. I recently have a big problem that makes me unable to eat well and can't sleep well, so I asked my friend to invite you here. I hope you can help me solve the problem soon. Oh, first of all, thanks for your hospitality. But we still don't know your situation. Please give me a brief summary of your problem. It seems that the reputation of Mr. Simmons spread very far. I want to ask you to help me see the house that I just built." Even though I have fully paid homage, there hasn't been a day since I completed the house where I can stay safe inside." Adam recounted his situation to us in a low, sad voice. Adam says his newly built house is not big but not small either. During the construction process, the builders were injured many times, but they were all minor accidents. Even though the builders reminded Adam, he didn't care much, until the house was finished. A few days ago, the house was completed, and his family of 3 moved in. Strange things began to happen from that day. At night, Adam's family of 3 were sleeping together in one bed, and they slept soundly until morning. But the strange thing is that when Adam opened his eyes in the morning, he saw the bright sun shining in his eyes, and he saw that his family of 3 were all lying in the yard. It is worth mentioning that it happened not only once or twice, 3 times in 5 consecutive days. Even more strangely, they had no idea what had happened. I also asked people to look at the house, but they didn't realize anything was wrong in the house, but my family didn't dare to live there anymore. My whole family moved to the house of Martin, my best friend, and then you were introduced to me by Martin, and he also helped me invite you over. I seem to have grasped the situation, and I could clearly see the bewildered look on Adam's face as he told us about his condition. That's why we invited you here today. Please help us. According to what Adam said, he asked many people to come to see the house, but no one noticed anything unusual. It was strange. I see, now take me to your house. After hearing about Adam's situation, Mr. Simmons got up and said he was going to Adam's new house to have a look. Martin and I also went along. Adam went ahead to guide us. Over here. This is my newly built house. After walking for a while, we also arrived at Adam's newly built house. The structure of the house looks quite good. I see Mr. Simmons looked around with a rather wistful expression on his face. Of course, I don't know anything about feng shui, so I don't understand Mr. Simmons was looking at something. In my opinion, this house is quite ordinary. The surrounding trees and roads are all good. I don't know if there is anything unusual here. The feng shui of this house is excellent. After a few minutes of consideration, I finally heard Mr. Simmons spoke up. Yes, before I built the house and after it happened, I asked people to look at it. They all said this house has good feng shui. Adam listens to Mr. Simmons said that sounded a bit disappointed. Maybe he was thinking Mr. Simmons came to the same conclusion as the others. However, the people who came to help you see feng shui didn't look carefully. Mr. Simmons still did not conclude but added another sentence, which surprised everyone standing there and felt curious. The feng shui here is excellent, but it is good to build houses for dead people, not to build houses for living people. The so-called good feng shui, according to Mr. Simmons, is suitable for burying the dead, not good for housing. After hearing this sentence, everyone was shocked. Don't you think it's strange that a place with good feng shui like this but never have someone built a house before you? Maybe they had a strange problem like this before. The facial expression of Mr. Simmons looked grave now. You mean, perhaps as we all understood what Mr. Simmons meant, and Adam understood, but he didn't dare to think about it. Adam asked Mr. Simmons again, wanted him to confirm. As you are understanding, your house is being built on the grave of the deceased. Mr. Simmons stopped circling but got straight to the point, that Adam's house dishonored the deceased. But it's not a big deal, and I can help you. But first of all, tonight my friends and I will have to stay here for a night. Adam said that he did not find any graves when digging the foundation to build the house, so he did not know that he had dishonored the deceased. Mr. Simmons says he needn't worry, and he can handle it this time. We'll have to stay here for one night tonight. Martin, prepare to help me with something. Perhaps Mr. Simmons had foreseen the situation before coming here, so he had all the necessary tools with him. What a brilliant exorcist. In front of the house, Mr. Simmons is teaching Martin and Adam something, but Mr. Simmons spoke in a low voice. I couldn't hear what they were saying. After finishing the instructions, Martin and Adam left, leaving the house to Mr. Simmons and me. Tonight I will join Mr. Simmons. Spent the night here, and it was a thrill. As soon as Mr. Simmons opened the front gate, and I reached up and took off my sunglasses. Me and Mr. Simmons stepped inside. I looked around the yard. At first, I thought that if there were problems with this place, I would see something inside Adam's yard, but unfortunately, I couldn't see anything. Mr. Simmons, did you ask Martin and Adam to prepare something? When night fell, I was in charge of tidying up the bed and getting ready for bed. I couldn't contain my curiosity, so I asked in the morning if what did Simmons tell the other two? No need to rush, you'll know right away. Mr. Simmons answered my question and smiled. He didn't explain it to me, but told me that I would know right away when the time came. While we were talking, someone knocked on the door. Then I saw Martin open the door and come in, with 2 buckets in his hands, which seemed heavy. I found him to be quite careful. I didn't have time to look to see what Martin had brought until the smell of urine hit my nose. I felt a strong and very unpleasant smell. I covered my nose because I couldn't stand the smell. After walking closer, I could clearly see in Martin's hand 2 buckets of urine. Hey, what are you doing bringing in here? Help me carry these 2 buckets out in the yard. It turns out Mr. Simmons couldn't stand the smell either. You put it in the yard for me. Then you can go home and rest, thanks. Mr. Simmons gave Martin a few more words. I could see Martin's contorted face as he carried 2 buckets of urine in his hands, but he didn't dare complain. Martin followed what Mr. Simmons said, so wished us good night, then carried 2 buckets back to the yard, and when he was done, he went back to his house. Mr. Simmons, what do you need 2 buckets of urine for? I really didn't guess what Mr. Simmons hid. I had no idea what he wanted to do, so I asked directly. Okay, now listen to this. Tonight we will do this, this and this. Mr. Simmons let me wait a while and then told me about his arrangement and told me to coordinate the action. I think a bit about what Mr. Simmons said. Then we turned off the lights and went to bed to sleep. Although I've been through a lot of exorcism things, this time I still feel very satisfied. I lay awake worrying, unable to sleep. In contrast to me, Mr. Simmons lay beside me, sleeping soundly. As soon as he fell back down for a moment, he was already snoring. At midnight, sleep comes. While I was half awake and half asleep thinking about what would happen tonight, suddenly I heard the door creak, and then the door was pushed open. The moment the door opened, a blast of cold air rushed inside the room. I wasn't wearing my glasses right now, so I could clearly see 2 ghosts gliding from outside the door into the room. Those 2 ghosts were wearing 2 shrouds, their silhouettes blurred, but I could faintly recognize them as 2 old ghosts, a man and a woman, who looked quite like a husband and wife. They glided to the side of Mr. Simmons, then glared at Mr. Simmons and me with 2 angry faces. Previously Mr. Simmons had told me in advance that, no matter what happened in the night or if I saw anyone strange, I was not to do anything, not to make a sound, I had to pretend to be asleep. Beside me, Mr. Simmons was sleeping soundly and snoring. I don't know if Mr. Simmons pretending to be asleep, or is he actually asleep. I opened my eyes slightly and watched them, as if they were about to do something to Mr. Simmons. Then I saw these 2 ghosts lift Mr. Simmons out of bed and wanted to bring Mr. Simmons go somewhere. At this time, I suddenly remembered Adam's story in the morning. Maybe they wanted to bring us into the yard, to scare us. I lay on the bed, squinting and waiting for them to bring Mr. Simmons out. After those two ghosts were out of my sight, I jumped up and got out of bed. After I walked up to the door, I tiptoed to the yard to check the situation, unsure what they wanted to do next. I see they put Mr. Simmons fell to the ground, then looked at Mr. Simmons and whispered something in his mouth, looking like he was casting a spell or cursing something, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. I watched when they weren't paying attention, quickly went out into the yard and walked quickly to where the 2 buckets of urine were, then quickly grabbed the 2 buckets. I quickly grabbed 2 buckets and ran to the 2 ghosts. All of these were exactly like what Mr. Simmons predicted and planned, but right now, it is not the time to show my admiration for Mr. Simmons. Mr. Simmons told me all his plans before he went to sleep. He acts as a decoy, and I will carry out the action. I will ambush them from behind. I took advantage when they were chanting something without noticing me. I stood behind and picked up a bucket of urine. Then I bumped into the head of a ghost standing closest to me. The ghost didn't notice me, so it didn't prepare in time, couldn't dodge or resist. After the ghost had a bucket of urine on its head, the ghost's body suddenly became smaller and smaller, and finally disappeared in the bucket falling to the ground. As soon as I successfully suppressed the first ghost, I did not dare to delay. While the other ghost was still stunned in panic, I took another bucket of urine and poured it over the other ghost's head. After having a bucket of urine on their heads, the 2 ghosts disappeared inside the 2 buckets, as if they were trapped inside. But it's not over yet. The bucket to my right shook very hard. Inside the bucket, the ghost was violently protesting. I was worried and afraid that the 2 buckets would break, and the 2 ghosts would escape, so I reached out and pressed down on the right bucket. But as soon as one bucket was pushed down by me and the other one continued to shake violently, I had to reach out with my other hand to push the other bucket down. At this point, both of my hands are no longer free. I could feel a great force inside the 2 buckets, and the 2 buckets rubbing against the ground made a very shrill sound. From the openings, black smoke continuously escaped outside. I watched nervously as the 2 buckets of urine were shaking so violently, I felt like it was about to burst. Just as my heart was pounding, I saw a beam of colored light hitting the buckets of urine. It's a yellow talisman. Thank goodness, Mr. Simmons is awake. Only now can I breathe a sigh of relief. The 2 buckets of urine were no longer shaking. Don't worry, what you need to do is done. I will talk to them now. Mr. Simmons saw my relief and reassured me. He said that everything was going very well and told me to stand aside so he could talk to those 2 old ghosts. Can you 2 tell me why you're disturbing this house later? You have taken us both down. There is nothing more to say. Mr. Simmons bowed slightly and asked. I heard an old sound coming from one of the buckets, a bizarre sound, like an echo coming from afar. At first, they refused to speak, but with the ingenuity of Mr. Simmons also coaxed them to speak. When we were old, we had a tough life. When we died, only the neighbors around us cremated the ashes and then buried the ashes deep in the ground, leaving no descendants to take care of our grave. We don't even have a decent grave. But fortunately, the people around knew and avoided the land where our ashes were located. But we were quiet for a few years. Then suddenly someone came to buy land to build a house. Our relatives sold this land inhumanely. Now the old neighbors have deceased, their children moved? Who will remind them? We did a few warning things, but they didn't seem to care. The old voice slowly told the old story. Since this house was built, our ashes have been suffocated by cement and soil all day. But we wouldn't want to harm anyone, so we thought of this way to warn them. What the elderly couple told me made me feel pity. As expected, this house has desecrated you. But just warning like that, the landowner can't understand. Now that the story is revealed, I suggest this. I will tell the landowner to bring your ashes to the church to be buried, and we'll go up to burn incense for the two of you a few times a year, as an apology. Do we have a term?" Mr. Simmons heard it and began to negotiate with the two ghosts. "If it's like as you say, that's great. We'll be able to rest in peace, and we won't need to disturb anyone anymore. 3 days later is a good day. I will tell them to dig up the ashes and bring them to the church." The two ghosts' voices were much more conciliatory now. In the end, they agreed with Mr. Simmons. As soon as we completed the agreement, Mr. Simmons reached out and tore the yellow talisman from the two buckets. When he removed the talisman, the bucket burst open, and thick black smoke was released. "You have to do as you say, or we won't let it go even if we have to broken our soul." Soon, black smoke gathered into the form of a person standing in front of us. "Don't worry. I definitely won't break a promise as simple as this," Mr. Simmons firmly assured the couple. Finally, he asked the two ghosts to show us where their ashes were buried. The elderly couple, after telling us where their ashes were buried, disappeared behind the wall. "Okay, now you can go to sleep in peace." After handling everything, Mr. Simmons told me to go back to sleep. "Mr. Simmons, you go to bed first. I want to wash my hands first." "Okay, let's go back to sleep." I couldn't fall asleep right away. My hands smelled of urine. I quickly went to the well and washed my hands with all my might. Because I was so excited, I forgot about this horrible smell. Early the next morning, Adam and Martin arrived. They were relieved to know that Mr. Simmons and I had a good night's sleep. Mr. Simmons simply recounted what had happened to him that night, then told them the promise he had made to the two ghosts of the elderly couple. I called my company to ask permission to take an extra 3 days off and stayed there with Mr. Simmons. 3 days later, we and Adam's family dug up the ashes of the elderly couple and went together to a church in the mountains nearby. Everything is fine. You should remember that you have to visit from time to pay respects and burn incense for them. Now we go first." Adam and his wife thanked Mr. Simmons and paid Mr. Simmons a little money. After that, we separated. Adam and his wife went to the church to bury the ashes, and Mr. Simmons and I go home. I want to stay here for a few days. If you are busy with work, please go back first. It's okay. I still have a few days off anyway. It's cool and peaceful here. I want to stay for a while. Mr. Simmons told me that despite the quietness and peacefulness of the place, it contained many bad things. Mr. Simmons spoke in a casual tone, but I got the feeling he was onto something.